So hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Forensic Psychology. In a previous episode, we talked about gangs and the role of trauma. And so the episode that we're going to focus on today is focusing a little bit more broadly on kind of psychological and criminological perspectives on gangs. We are really fortunate to be joined by Craig Pinkney and Dr. Chantal Scaillet today. So Craig is a criminologist, urban youth specialist, PhD researcher, and founder and director of Solve, the Centre for Youth Violence and Crime. He is acknowledged as one of the UK's leading experts on responding to gangs. He's also a qualified youth worker with 16 years experience in outreach work as a gang exit strategist, as a mentor, advisor, and if that wasn't enough, he's also a filmmaker. So Chantal is a consultant clinical psychologist who has considerable experience working in prisons and NHS settings. She is published in the areas of working with personality difficulties and addressing trauma with young adult men. She is currently the strategic clinical lead of the Pathways Complex Needs Service in Aylesbury Prison, and she's also a guest lecturer at Queen's Mary's University. So Chantal and Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful to have you on board and very lucky actually given all your expertise. So we'll just start off really kind of gently. So Chantal, would you like to tell us about how you got to where you are today?
Part of my story, and I can disclose this, I grew up in South Africa. And I guess growing up during quite a turbulent political time sort of pointed me to levels of injustices and things that were going on socially, politically, psychologically. And I've always been drawn to then wanting to work in a field where I feel I could have done something and thought about the situation a little bit differently. And so I've always been drawn to psychology and I haven't looked back. So this is a decision I made when I was quite young. And I started reading. I was really fond of sort of coming of age books, and I was really fond of stories about resilience and how people can overcome certain traumas and difficulties. So I guess this is how I've come to then work more towards forensic as well, where there's a massive, it feels, level of injustices within this the system of sort of forensic and people who end up in prison. So that's how I've ended up studying in the field that I have.
And how did you get to come working in prisons?
I started my career working in substance misuse. So I was an assistant psychologist working in substance misuse. And then when I qualified, I stayed in that field. And I think it was just a natural progression, working towards secure settings and then gravitated towards prisons. I started working in prisons in 2014, and that's when I joined the OPD services. So it's a network of services that is co-funded by the NHS and Criminal Justice, and they have an array and diverse projects, and I'm part of the project that's Pan London, within one of the young offenders institution. And before then I was working with adults in different prisons as well. So I guess I gravitated towards there outside of secure mental health and then towards prisons, which I must say, I think I found, I really enjoy working in prisons. I know it sounds a bit strange, but there is something about the sense of hope that you find in prisons, which is a little bit different to thinking about people in sort of secure mental health services. There's something that draws me towards prison, and it's that sort of being able to work with people so that they have a different perspective on things and begin to think about themselves in a more hopeful way.
And Craig, what about you? How did you get to where you are today and setting up your company around you looking at focusing on youth violence?
I guess, inner city, young boy growing up in Birmingham, coming from a family of activists. My grandparents were quite significant in the journey of many families in the Windrush era, and they started the community provision from their household. So for those that are familiar with Birmingham and some of the historical kind of context of Birmingham around things like the Muhammad Ali Centre, when Muhammad Ali came many years ago, My grandma was one of the pioneers around starting that particular movement, around supporting communities against racism and ensuring that people were safe. So I guess coming from that type of family, you know, as a kind of child, you don't really understand the kind of greatness of what you've been born into, I would say. So I've always been around individuals that are in education, individuals that were fighting for people's rights, and just kind of that community spirit. I guess as you get older and you start to make mistakes and you start to kind of go down the wrong road, you then start to, you're oftentimes, what I would say, reminded about where you're actually coming from. And I would say that it was only until leaving school where I kind of developed that passion of working with children and young people. And it was actually only later that I had a series of youth workers and mentors that said, you know what, Craig, you'd be a brilliant youth worker. So whilst I then developed my skills to become a youth worker, and then I had the opportunity to go to university, I would say that was probably my biggest challenge, because as I said, I left school, I didn't have the best educational journey, you know, leaving school without no GCSEs. And then going into university and really challenging myself, and really kind of learning the craft and the art of youth work. And then leaving university, I then had an opportunity to work in Birmingham Youth Service for the City Council. And I would say that that was my beginning, because what I was experiencing was a lot of young men that I was working with, that I witnessed many of them being sentenced to life sentences in prison. Sadly, some of them had passed away due to violence. And then one of the questions that I was asking is why? And I think that kind of motivated me to explore that much further, and why I then went on to do a master's degree in criminology and criminal justice to study that most important question, why young people were engaging in criminal behavior. And then I would say that that was kind of the further development of just really wanting to explore that. And then I had the opportunity to work for an organization or a project as such, known as the EU Gangs Project. And when I went on board, I was quickly invited to deliver a series of seminars around my frontline experiences working with young people that were impacted by violence. And then a number of months later, I was then given the opportunity to be the EU Gangs lead. So that meant that I was able to go to Romania, Cyprus, Italy, Greece, France, and really kind of learn youth violence in its context, in their settings, and then come back and deliver bespoke programs around responding to that. So then having the opportunity then to do that gave me another opportunity to then start lecturing at the university. And that's why I was lecturing at UCB here in Birmingham, where I taught youth and community development, criminology, criminal studies, as well as offender management. And then the bespoke program from the EU Gangs Project is something that we rolled out across the country. And then I had a very unique opportunity. I got a knock at the door from the Ministry of Justice in Jamaica in the Caribbean. A number of years, a few years ago actually, the country was declared a state of emergency, where there was over 100 people that got killed in the space of like 6 days. A number of firearms had somehow mysteriously ended up on the island. And as you can imagine, young people that got their hands on those things, there was just a really, really bad time. So I was called over to advise the government for a period of time. And I would say that was one of my highlight moments. So being able to kind of do that, and you can imagine my family were really scared of what was ultimately going on, but they looked after me and I was safe. Unfortunately, I had a lot of family members all over there as well. So it was nice that a lot of the events that I was speaking at, you know, meeting cousins and aunts that I'd never met before in my whole life was really a nice experience. And then that kind of brings me to why I then started my PhD. In 2016-17, many of you are aware, West Midlands was kind of acknowledged as the gun crime capital of Europe. And I started to ask the question why. And one of the things that I was noticing was there was a series of music videos that were being uploaded onto YouTube, and it was causing a series of behaviors within my community. So as the added variable to what was going on in my community, I said, we have to start to look more critically about the role of social media platforms, music, and its contribution to violence, not suggesting and leaning towards the kind of ahead of the Met's narrative that it's only about music and violence of why individuals are engaging in particular behaviors. One of the things that I wanted to kind of acknowledge is not utilize those things as a scapegoat, rather than to build onto some of those conversations that was missing within the criminological space. And that's kind of how the PhD started. And then on the back of that, I got to a particular point where I really wanted to kind of develop a lot of the kind of initiatives that I always had and was really passionate about. And then that was kind of the birth of Solve, where I started a Centre for Youth Violence and Conflict, where I wanted to specifically look at research, training and consultancy. And then that led to, you know, supporting the National Youth Agency, the Police and Crime Commission, violent reduction units up and down the country, Norfolk City Council Children's Services, helping them around their high-risk cases around CCE, CSE. And it's really kind of having that opportunity to really kind of spread my wings in a range of different places. And I guess, you know, in conclusion, I would say that my unique selling point is what I always say is part of my slogan, is bridging the gap between what I call academia and the streets. So it's not just about having the kind of textbook knowledge, but really having that real frontline, real raw practice, that when I'm delivering and I'm engaging with people, it's about being able to kind of speak from a place of information, but give people that kind of reality. So I run away from jargonistic terms and models and theories, but I do utilize those to kind of ground everything that I'm ultimately doing. So when those that are thinking about becoming individuals that want to contribute to this particular space, you know, it's about how do we get straight to it? Because bottom line is, when I'm working in the community, they couldn't care less whether I'm a doctor or not. They couldn't care less what title and accolade that I have. It's just about responding to those particular families. And with the kind of issues that are happening, you know, citywide as it relates to youth violence and conflict and supporting children and their families, it's just about getting to the root cause of what the problems are and trying to fix them to the best of our ability. And I guess the most important thing is around things like clinical supervision, ensuring that, you know, workers that are in this particular space, and I'm a big advocate of therapy, and having something that you can vent and unpack, you know, because working with, you know, as I said, families, there's been a number of murders that I have had to support and respond to, and the families that are impacted by those things. And I think the kind of, when you think of what I would say the timeline from the moment an incident happens up until someone's convicted for murder, you know, that is quite a long time frame. And when it's happened frequently, it can have an adverse impact on you as an individual in that space. And I think a lot of people go in with passion, thinking, I just want to support, I just want to help, I just want to change the world. But, you know, but dealing with, you know, those traumas is quite significant. And one of the things that I've always been concerned about is kind of how I become desensitized to these particular things. And as I said, you know, when you speak to a mother that's, you know, crying from her gut that her son or her daughter has just been taken in a very trivial circumstance, you know, how do you really kind of give comfort to a mother or father that's going through that? You know, how do you give comfort to siblings, you know, when they can't understand, you know, the context of, you know, how family members ultimately died? And then also in the court scenario as well, when you see both families that are dealing with the situation, both perpetrator and victim, that embarrassment, that shame, that guilt, that hurt from perpetrators' families when they're like, they didn't bring up their child to be out there taking other young people's lives. And I think that is the kind of situation. And I think that's where, you know, the idea of solve ultimately come from. You know, we would like to try and solve some of the problems of society ills.
I mean, I remember working with a person who had sort of committed a similar offence as what you're talking around, and his mum came in and talked to us about the impact it had on her, just sort of taking his children to school in the morning. You know, people would be shouting at her and swearing at her, and she said, it feels like I'm doing this life sentence with him.
And I think that is the biggest challenge, and I think what I call the ripple effect within our communities, this is ultimately what it is.
And so just thinking then, Craig and Chantal, so when you're thinking about a gang, so what is a gang?
When we look at the literature around gangs, we know that within a European context, that there is no consensus on what a gang is. And you look at the earlier writers around gangs, one of the things that oftentimes happens is we generally look at gangs through an American lens. So when you look at the kind of structure of gangs within the United States of America, it's not comparable when we think about gangs within a British or UK context. So two things that people generally do is they either look at gangs through the kind of makeup or the structure of the gang. You know, there's a hierarchy and people kind of looking for leaders versus those that are on the ground that may be considered runners, for example. Or you have writers that speak specifically about behaviors. So the types of behaviors that individuals may be involved in, for example, postcode violence. So one of the things that I advocate is that maybe we need to consider definitions in a localized context, because when you look at definitions that are written, you know, by your Pitts, your Holdsworths, and your other individuals that write about gangs, they talk about the estate and the olders. But me being from Birmingham, we don't have an estate. So as you can see, the definition doesn't fit within a Birmingham, West Midlands context. And that's the point that I'm making. So one of the things that I advocate, as I've just mentioned, is maybe creating localized definitions so those organizations that are working in a multifaceted way can understand what's going on. So one of the activities that I normally do with a lot of organizations nationally is I get them to look at Simon Holdsworth and Tara Young's 3-point typology of urban collectives, where they talk about 3 distinct types of groups that we see. So they talk about peer groups, they talk about street gangs, they talk about organized criminal groups, and all have ultimately different functions. But again, the way in which that is written, in my opinion, is static. It doesn't acknowledge the kind of contemporary context of the way that young people are right now. Why am I suggesting this? Because you have young people that may live in a particular community and particular area code that may not necessarily subscribe to a gang, but because they live in a particular postcode or in a particular geographical space, those that live on the outside of that particular space may target them for that particular reason. And based on that kind of problematic nature of gangs, that's where a lot of organizations have been able to, what I would argue, abuse people's human rights, like the gang matrix of London. So you have young people that end up on these particular databases based on intelligence that oftentimes is linked to things that is not oftentimes accurate. So if a young person lives on the same street, and let's say there are 2 young people that do subscribe to particular gangs in that local area, if a young man lives next door to them and then happens to be walking on the same street of them, is that young person in a gang? Because you see that person walking with them on that particular street. And that's why I'm saying that it's problematic, because what we oftentimes do is we just look at the kind of on-surface behaviors with people, but we don't actually acknowledge the context of which individuals are coming from. So I would say that there is no consensus when we're talking about gangs. There's multiple definitions, but what I'm an advocate for is utilizing definitions in a localized context to make sense to what you're ultimately responding to.
How do you change? How do you change people's views and attitudes about that?
That is the wider challenge. I also argue that when we're talking about gangs, it's also something that I believe that we need to also address the elephant in the room. Because when we're talking about gangs also, there's also racial undertones to this as well. When you hear the word gang or street gang, the first thing that you may think, and when I say we, I'm talking about the wider context and how it's projected, is that you automatically think young person, and then you probably think young male, and then you might link to then a particular ethnic group. So then when we think about gangs, that's what we consider, and that's where these databases highlighted the high level of racial bias and profiling towards particular groups. Because when you look at things like hooligans, for example, that are involved in the same type of violence, but linked to a sport, which is also a group, that engage in violence, that subscribe to a particular symbol or a particular location or particular area. And when they engage in violent behaviors, that's not considered gang violence. Or what about when you've got individuals that are drunk on an evening at the pub and they decide that they want to engage in a brawl outside of the pub or outside of a local bar? That's not oftentimes considered gangs. But when you find young men, specifically from ethnic communities, automatically that's associated with street gangs. And then there's also the other level when we're talking about organized criminal groups that are oftentimes in the community. We're talking about your mafias now, your Italian, your Polish, your Russian, your Albanian mafias that are involved in the import and export of Class A substances and also firearms and weaponry from Eastern Europe. But when they engage in their behavior, we don't look at that as gangs. So as you can see, it's quite complex, even with the kind of examples that I've projected. So it's interesting that when we utilize the word gang, you know, what do we ultimately mean? And it's kind of similar as when we're talking about things like terrorism. Perfect example. That's quite synonymous when we hear the word terrorism now, automatically with the faith of Islam. But when did that ultimately happen? It was only post September 11th that now that when we hear the word terrorism, it's oftentimes linked to one specific group. But then we know that far-right extremism, in terms of the data, commit more acts of violent behavior as it relates to their belief system, as it relates to individuals that are involved in religious terrorism, if that makes sense. And then the same thing as it relates to knife crime. So we use the words like knife crime, and again, that becomes synonymous with young people from ethnic groups that are involved in particular behaviors. But then we don't consider knife crime as it relates to fights that happen outside local bars and local pubs. We don't consider knife crime to be when an individual is violent towards his spouse or her spouse, and they utilize a knife in that context in order to harm that individual. We don't frame that as knife crime. But when you look at the definitions and what it is, when you're talking about the use of an object in order to engage in a violent behavior, then you realize that the scope of these definitions are actually quite wide. So the question is, why then do we utilize these definitions in order to make sense to the wider audience of what things ultimately are?
What I find quite interesting is that the themes that run through these young people's lives, and when they do talk to you, you know, they're sort of surprised that others would see them and perceive them as part of a gang, and often they will say it's just a group of friends, and we're a collective of friends. We're not, you know, part of a gang, and it is quite telling in terms of how easy it is then to reject a whole grouping that belongs in society and reject them as being violent, part of a gang. And then, you know, you were saying, Craig, in terms of, you know, the labeling, it makes it easier, I guess, then to put aside those people and to label them collectively as bad, as dangerous, and therefore we don't really have to do much about it. We can just stick young people of a certain age, you know, from the age of 16 to life in prison, and then that's okay. And then, you know, you do certain things to try and help them. So you have certain programs or projects, but that's not going to hit the sides. And I think for me, that's one of the most telling things when you work with the young people who want to actually participate in society and want to be citizens, but from a very, very, very young age, they've been excluded through no fault of their own. They've been excluded because of chance. And I call it chance because it depends into, you know, the type of life that life has dealt you. And by chance, they've ended up in a certain situation, and then it sets off a whole series of events, which includes, you know, being perhaps excluded from school. So it starts there, but before then, perhaps going into care, and before then, perhaps witnessing certain, you know, traumatic experiences. And then it's almost like a chain reaction. For me, one of the most damning thing is exclusion. And then putting young people with other young people who've been excluded in specialist schools, where they also not expected to thrive or to achieve, and then end up following a certain course. And I think that's really sad, really, that you have, it's almost like a template for saying, actually, this is, it may seem that from the beginning, because of chance, this person ends up running, you know, and developing these milestones so different to somebody who's been given a different opportunity.
And I was going to say, I think that's one of our important questions for you about why you think people end up on that pathway, really.
Well, I think there's a lot. I mean, there's Craig talked about trauma, and it is that it's, you know, cumulative trauma is being excluded from society, is having less, you know, privileges, is having less opportunity. So if you go back, you know, to a beginning when you have a young child who is not given as much opportunities as another child, there's something about the way that the young person may then view themselves in terms of in relationally to other people, but also views themselves in relation to other people who have other things. And it is this lack of opportunity, the lack of being able to be to be given, you know, a childhood where you expect the young person to thrive, where you build in the young person, where you invest in the young person so that they can thrive to become people that they want to become. So, but rather we sort of take away and we label and we say, oh, he's got behavioral problems, or she's got behavioral problems, they've got ADHD, they've got ADHD, and then you say, well, actually, this is the precursor to antisocial personality. And then already a narrative builds around the young person. And along with all the cumulative trauma, it becomes more and more difficult for the young person to sort of come out. I mean, adolescence is already a difficult time. And on top of it, you heap on all of these labels and also the apparent lack of investment in these young people as well, you know, through different, it's very systemic. So through a lot of different organizations where the young person may have been taken away from their family of origin, put into care, and just what happens there, you know, there isn't enough scrutiny as to what happens to a young person when they start to be taken away from an environment and placed into another one, and they're sort of left there to fend for themselves. And I think this is probably the beginning, you know, when young people feel that they're not worthy to be invested in. I don't know what you think, Craig, but there is something, when you speak to them, there's something there.
I'm in total agreement, you know, so what Chantal's kind of framing is the kind of notion of the kind of school to prison pipeline, and kind of spoke about that kind of continuum. And I think that it goes even further. You know, when one of my colleagues was talking about in her work around the nursery to prison pipeline, that even at early years, you see children and young people, male and female, experiencing a number of issues. When we're talking about the idea of those traumas, those adverse childhood experiences, and almost carrying or young people ultimately, impacted by that up until that adolescent stage. And then when we're seeing a series of behaviors now playing out, the system responds in a particular type of way. So we isolate young people, we further marginalize young people. And then when they're marginalized, what happens then is we don't know how to respond. And then the easiest thing that we do is just throw them into those particular settings, like those pupil referral units, as mentioned, when they're surrounded by individuals that have different behavioral and educational needs. And especially if a child or a young person has made a bad decision in a school setting and ends up in that space. And what I mean by that is you've got young people that are academically sound, but they may have, for example, brought a knife to a school. And because of some policies within a school setting, and individuals are not looked at by case, a young person is permanently excluded from the school by carrying a knife, nothing to do with kind of their academic attainment. And then they end up in this particular setting where there may not be that kind of level and push for academic success at that particular type of level. So then what happens is young people then conform to the kind of system at B, that it's okay, it's kind of laxy-daisy in the way. And I'm not suggesting that all pupil referral units are like that, but from my experiences, there isn't that kind of level of, we want you to have that same level of understanding, that same level of academic attainment compared to what the mainstream school or private schools are ultimately suggesting. And then what you then have is those children and young people out in the community, and their vulnerabilities are so high. And then what happens is those same organized criminals that I mentioned before, you know, target those particular individuals. And I think that that links to the conversation about COVID-19. So when you look at the literature over the last 12 months that is talking about the impact of COVID-19 on children and young people, it's quite significant of what they're talking about, the risk of mental health and the increase of mental health within our communities, the fact that young people are in households where they're exposed to high levels of violence, you know, high levels of abuse. So we may see them out and about in the street, and we make the assumption that they're just not conforming to government guidelines. We're not recognizing that there's a whole context of what they're running away from. And then we're talking about young people that are experiencing what is known as the digital divide, the have and the have-nots, as it relates to things like having the internet, having links to laptops or tablets to be able to speak to their teachers whilst they're in education. And then you've got young people that are now engaging in risky behaviors. And especially as it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning about social media, you know, TikTok is being used to coerce young people into behaviors. It was only this week that article, I believe it came out in the Guardian or the Times, of how young people are being groomed on Snapchat. A young person was giving a narrative talking about speaking to a complete stranger for 20 minutes on Snapchat and then was involved in a county line. So we know that social media platforms are being utilized even more than it did before in the pandemic to target specific young people. And then what's happening, one of the things that I've experienced in some of the communities that I've worked in, you've got young people then that are out and about for whatever reason. And these individuals that are involved in violence and in gangs see a young person that dresses similar to them, that may look like them, and automatically make the assumption that if you're out and about at this particular time, then maybe you're involved in the beef or in the conflict. So therefore we'll shoot at you, therefore we'll stab you. And then what we're finding is a lot of innocent young people that are naturally not involved in these particular behaviors are getting caught up in that cycle of violence. A lot of young people that are being targeted are going missing because they want money, because we also have to acknowledge with the capitalist society at B, you know, the marketing of PlayStation games and having a new PlayStation and clothes and trainers, you know, that hasn't stopped in the pandemic. So young people are sitting thinking, wait there, well, I might want these things. I can't access them, but there's so many opportunities online that people are ultimately presenting to me to get that. So when we talk about then the cycle of violence, that's the reason why I always try to push people away from just the gang narrative, because young people that engage in violence are not always young people that are involved in gang membership. So I know a lot of young people that I've engaged with that actually have access to firearms and weapons that don't belong to a gang. So then when we talk about the definition of a gang, then you understand then why it becomes so complex and why I advocate for that need of trying to understand what is taking place in your context. Because I can give you a definition of what's happening in Birmingham, but it may not fit necessarily in some of the estates in London. It may not fit in terms of some of the places in Nottingham, or working in Norfolk, working with young people in places like Great Yarmouth or Norwich, and it doesn't fit in those particular contexts. So it's about understanding, you know, how do young people get to this particular place? And it is systemic, as Chantal's mentioned, that kind of marginalization and alienation of our young people, along with the consistent adverse childhood experiences. And I would also say due to the social disorganization of practitioners not understanding how to engage, understanding what the problem is, pulling it in its right context. And the easiest thing to do is to send them to Child Secure. The easiest thing to do is put them in residential care homes. The easiest thing to do is put them in pupil referral units, or they end up in the prison estate, or sadly, mental health institutions pick them up. And then that becomes the cycle again.
There's a whole initiative that started probably only 5 years ago, shockingly, which looks at this idea of perinatal psychology, which is even further back. This idea that you work with mothers and fathers and caregivers who are having babies, and then even in those really early sections of life, you know, year 1, year 2, there's arguably work to be done even further back with the families. You could start almost before children are born.
If your life at the moment is one of stress, or if you are in a relationship that's not working, or if you're struggling as a single parent, it's very difficult to have a future orientation which is hopeful for the child. And so it begins then, you know, it begins about how you hold somebody in mind as somebody who's going to be, you have the best in mind for them. And if already your life is stressful, when the child's not even born, it becomes obvious then that it's going to be a difficult start in life. And that's where things like early start and things that the government had put in place before to help is all gone now. But that's where the prevention should start there. You know, you talk about preventative, and you talk about almost like prophylactic, you know, care. It should start there, where children are thought about in mind, and then things are put in place to help people, to help parents but not the opposite, not excluding a child, because by the time they get to adolescence, it becomes quite difficult for them to manage in school. And it's just all wrong. It feels like it's upside down.
Craig, you said something really interesting about county lines, and I wonder if you could explain or say a bit more about how that fits with gangs.
So county lines is ultimately a process where a child or a young person is either coerced or makes a decision to engage in a behavior where they leave their region, generally from an inner city area, into a rural space, where they operate a telephone line on behalf of a group or an organization to sell Class A substances. So for example, me leaving from Birmingham and decide that I want to go to Wales, I set up a telephone line. I might engage with some of the local addicts in that particular area, and then I find a base. That base may be the household of the addict, or it may even be the household of an elderly person in the community. And whilst I'm in this particular household, that's where I may either store the drugs or even do my day-to-day sales. So me standing on the corner of the road is now transformed now into being inside of a household where I can do my day-to-day activities. But the problem is with a lot of young people that are being coerced to do these particular things is that they're given kind of what I would say kind of a idealistic kind of nice vision of what's going to happen when they get into these particular environments. And then when they get there, they're told they're not allowed to sleep because as you can imagine, product may go missing. They're expected to money manage. They're expected to deal with behaviors of adults, and especially if addicts need a fix. And then not really preparing them for some of the other issues around overdoses, the fact that you may have a police raid, the fact that there may be other groups in that area that are fighting for territory, that that child or young person may get caught up. And then also the reality that the money that they think they're going to make is oftentimes not the case. So young people find themselves in these particular scenarios with a decision that they've made with a group, generally an adult or someone that is considered their peer or slightly older. They end up in these particular scenarios and they don't know how to get out. So working with a lot of young people that have been impacted by these particular things, I think that opens the door to understand what modern slavery ultimately is, because it is that process. And one of the things that I always kind of, when speaking to young people, they talk about this idea of debt, the fact that the reason why many of them are working or sitting in these households is because they've accumulated some sort of debt. Now, these debts are oftentimes what I would argue almost a trap. And that's what happens. So we'll look after a young person for a long period of time, give him some money every other week or whatever. So once he's got himself some nice things, and then it may get to a point where money is quite tight. So for example, we know that the drug trade has been impacted in COVID-19. So that means the price of cocaine and heroin has increased. So these greedy organized criminals, they don't want to lessen their prices. So the easiest thing to do is if we get more runners, more people involved in selling and distributing the drugs, but then we don't really want to pay them. So I can set you up. I can put you in a situation where the house gets raided, for example. And then when that particular product goes missing, then you may owe me 10 grand, you may owe me 30 grand. And you've got 14, 15-year-olds that have debts of like 10, 15, 20 grand. And they don't know what to do. Their families can't afford it. So the only thing that makes better sense is you go right back onto the county line. You go right back into selling in the local community. And that's often what happens. But I also have a critique around county lines, because when we use the word county lines, it makes the suggestion that a young person goes missing and is found out of county. And one of my biggest concerns around county lines is, what about the children and young people that go get coerced on their front doorstep, that don't leave the county? So whilst we have a lot of government strategy and a lot of organizations have initiatives to respond to county lines, what about those young people that don't leave the county? What about the challenges that they ultimately face? So a young person may get coerced and be selling drugs literally around the corner from the household of where he lives. And I think that's important that we consider that in its context. But what that also demonstrates is kind of the government agendas. If we could go back to, 2009, 2010, when we entered into the recession, and you remember the disturbances, the riots that happened in 2011, and then going into 2012 when Theresa May put that first cross-government report out around responding to gangs and serious youth violence. From that particular moment up until today, it's almost like the title or the romantic terminologies has changed with the weather. So it started off with, responding to gangs and serious youth violence. And then you may remember the era where it was focusing on young girls and sexual exploitation. And now the buzz and romantic word is county lines. And one of my concerns is that when the government agendas are changed and we get fancy with all of these new terminologies, what we oftentimes forget about is some of the stuff that Chantal was talking about, is that kind of impact of young people or on young people in those particular journeys. And when the focus ultimately changes, then we ignore the other young people that may be also impacted by these things. And that's why I made the assertion before about when we focus on gangs and look at gangs in a silo, then what about those young people in our communities that are just as violent, that are engaged in the same behaviors, and we're only focusing solely on gangs?
Sometimes we think about gangs, we've got a particular idea, our society has a particular idea that it might be young males from a certain ethnic group. Do we know much about kind of involvement of females in gangs?
Well, 6 years ago, there was a number of pieces of literature that was published that made the suggestion that young women that are involved in gangs are highly susceptible to issues around sexual exploitation. Now, I was quite critical of that particular type of narrative, only because when I was doing a lot of research nationally around young men and young women that are involved in gang behaviors, that wasn't something that I systematically found. When we talk about young men and young women that may belong to a gang or may be involved in particular behaviors, we automatically use the same kind of expressions of what happens in that particular group. And I always say, if I was to talk to a group of young people in the park, and let's say there's a group of boys and a couple of girls, for example, and let's say one of those young women have a relationship with one of those males, and let's say the relationship breaks down, why are we calling that sexual exploitation? Because you wouldn't say that without the gang label. So it's interesting that when we talk about those interpersonal relationships amongst individuals that may belong to gangs, it's interesting what we do. And I think the second thing that I criticize is that gang writers, when they come from this particular angle, we always put women in a submissive position. So we make this assumption that young women are functioning from a deficit, when we know that when we're talking about the role of young women in gangs is not the same as young men. And I would argue that young women actually have a significant place and a significant role in gangs, especially when we're talking about sisters, when we're talking about girlfriends, when we're talking about wives, when we're talking about mothers of individuals that are involved in criminal behavior. So women actually hold significant power. My question is, where does this narrative come from where all women that are involved in gangs are somehow susceptible to sexual violence or sexual exploitation? Now, what I'm not saying when I'm expressing this particular point is that women have experienced these particular issues. What I'm not saying is that women haven't been sexually exploited. Well, of course they have. But to push the narrative that all young women that are involved in gangs start from that deficit position, that all men somehow just want to sexually exploit them, I think that's what's misleading. And so when we hear about girls in gangs, it's when you read the literature, always from that position and never from the position of, well, the sister of the well-known gang member in the local area, she actually plays a significant role because she knows that significant role, because she knows if anybody disrespects her, she's going to call her brother. Now, that doesn't sound like someone that is from a place of exploitation in the sense that, you know, she's a vulnerable individual. And what I'm saying is, in conclusion, is I think we need to re-look at the role that young women play as it relates to young men.
And I think as well, it's about how society sort of fragilizes females as well. And there's something about, you know, the what we portray, you know, what a woman should be or what a girl should be. Mm-hmm. And I think there is that sort of psychologically in our minds, you know, we think, well, naturally a girl who belongs to a gang, she must be exploited because, you know, girls don't do that. And I think, again, it's about updating our ideas about gender.
Yes.
And updating, our ideas about how young people are, because, a young girl in 1950 is very different to a young woman in 2021.
Yes.
And so, but it gets stuck. And I think these narratives do get stuck. And I go back to this idea of labels. It suits us as a society systemically to think that, only one group is bad, and that they sort of corrupt everybody around them. So, anyone who's in a gang is bad, and whatever they touch, whoever they attract to their group is, they somehow corrupt everything. And I think it's about updating those views.
Well, but what is the role of psychology or criminology? But so I suppose those disciplines are quite close together. I actually did my criminology degree before I changed to forensic psychology, so they have quite a crossover. How do these disciplines help to kind of work with people in gangs? What can we offer?
I think it's all about relationships, and it's about the perception you hold in mind about the person that's in front of you. And if you believe that the person who's in front of you, so if you're a psychologist and you're working with a young person, and if you believe that they are from the outset bad, then you will have a certain way of or wanting to change them because they are bad. And so I think the role should be of psychology and criminology is just to mothball all those ideas and to think systemically, to think about trauma, to think about how you can start to the hope that you have for the young person that's in front of you. You want to be able to somehow transpose that into the young person so they can start having a much more hopeful future rather than a foreshortened future about their expectation that actually, you know what, I'm probably going to die by the time I'm 30 because of my lifestyle. So I think for me, that's the role of psychology and, criminal. It's just to instill a sense of hope, to be authentic in the way that you work with the person. So I do think that if you come from a base of wanting to change the person, that's just, who are we that you think that we are so, fantastic that we can just change another human being? It doesn't work that way. It's about seeing the other person as a worthy human being, as worthy as you are, as worthy as everybody else, authentically, and believing that, in hope, and also thinking about reframing these relationships and thinking about, the young person has adapted and has related to other people, maybe from a base of mistrust. What is that about? How can we understand that? How can we begin to understand the psychology of the young person, how that interacts with the psychology of yourself, society, etc. So I think that's the role. So there's a bit of philosophy there as well. It's very integrative. It's about treating another person as a human being.
I think the only thing that I would also include is that both disciplines push forward the narrative, and we don't then get stuck, like what Chantal's saying, as it relates to the ideas and the understanding of what groups are, how they formulate, and also about what needs to be done. And I would say that the literature also pushes us into that new conversation about what does the solution look like. So we move from the same questioning, what is a gang, how do gangs operate, because there's 50 years worth of literature that answer the same question. And I say that we're still asking the same question, even in the way in which we're constructing. So I know that a lot of students are going to be watching this, and I would say just look at the literature. The questions are there. There's things from the 1940s, 50s that are talking about there is no consensus in terms of a gang, but we're still asking the same question. So one of the things that we should be looking at now is what is the literature saying now? And what the literature has been saying for a long period of time, the World Health Organization has said this, is that we need to be looking at violence as a public health issue. Mm-hmm. We need to understand it as a public health issue and respond to it as such. So I would like to think that the conversations that then move forward from these particular points is that where do these respective disciplines fulfill the need to give an articulate answer, whether that's academic, whether that's real, bridging that gap between academia and the streets. So those that are wanting to embrace and work with individuals in a range of different capacities can embrace that public health approach and utilizing models and concepts in a contemporary form in a contemporary way that meets the needs of different children and young people and their families that are experiencing violence.
So Chantal and Craig, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. It's been absolutely fascinating to listen to you. I think given us a lot of food for thought actually around about not getting stuck in societal's perhaps view and narratives of gang and youth violence, and how to think a little bit more systemically, and also the importance of, you know, sitting and working with the person in front of you. So it's been an absolute privilege to have you both today, and fascinating to hear about your work. And there's just one thing left to say: let's talk forensic psychology.